Okay, welcome all to this presentation on our paper where we prove that optimal continual learning, that's continual learning without catastrophic forgetting, generally has perfect memory and is NP-hard. And this is joint work with Hisham, who's based at ANU in Australia, and Tom, who's working for Amazon at the moment. Okay, first I'll go over the spotlights of this paper. So this is a high-level summary for the next 3 minutes. And in particular, the paper provides 3 theoretical contributions, the first of which being that we connect set theoretic notions to catastrophic forgetting and continual learning. And then we use this connection in 2 ways. Firstly, to prove that generally avoiding catastrophic forgetting and continual learning, which we call optimal continual learning, is NP-hard. And secondly, that avoiding catastrophic forgetting also will generally need perfect memory. And this is 2 main practical ramifications. The first of which is that if you actually run a continual learning algorithm, what you're really doing is running a polynomial time heuristic for an NP-hard problem. And the second ramification is that it explains why memorization-based continual learning algorithms generally have been found to work more reliably than continual learning algorithms that are based on regularization strategies. And so just the gist of the set theoretic notions here is very simple. We come from this out of an angle of saying, well, if you want to know what catastrophic forgetting really is in the context of your problem, what you need is some criterion that decides whether or not you have forgotten the past catastrophically. So that requires you to specify some criterion calligraphy C. And the next step is then to say, well, we specify sets as the sets of parameters so that your optimality criterion is satisfied on the tth task. We call these satisfiability sets, and they're abbreviated SAT-T. And then it becomes obvious that not suffering catastrophic forgetting, which means being optimal with respect to your criterion on all tasks, is equivalent to having a parameter that lies at the intersection of previous satisfiability sets at each task T. And this yields this nice picture down here where every time you're trying to be in the yellow intersection between previous satisfiability sets and the current one. And, and if you put this all together and you actually think about the algorithm you need to solve this problem, you'll realize that at task T, you don't yet know what the next task is that you will encounter. And so you're really trying to navigate this sort of tree where at each time point you need to be, at each task you need to be prepared for every possible task at the next step. And this ultimately is what causes you to both solve an NP-hard problem, but also that you need perfect memory in order to navigate this sort of tree structure you see here. Okay, so in more detail, the structure for the rest of the 12 minutes is that I'll first walk you through the connection with set theory, then talk about the NP-hardness, which directly relates to the notion of set intersections that you've seen on the previous slide. Then we'll talk about perfect memory, which relates to navigating this tree that we've just seen. And then I'll quickly go over the practical ramifications. In case you need a refresher on what continual learning is and what catastrophic forgetting is, essentially you get a sequence of tasks which have non-overlapping or partially non-overlapping label and input and output spaces. And what you're trying to do at each task T is find some parameter value theta T, which fits the current task, but also the previous tasks. And the difficulty generally is that the parameter values you get as you have processed sufficiently many tasks don't work anymore on previous tasks. And this phenomenon is called catastrophic forgetting. Now, before we can proceed, we need to define a few terms here. Theta T is just the parameter value that you obtain after task T. I should note here that this looks very frequentist-like or estimation-like, but actually the same logic applies to the Bayesian paradigm. We elaborate on that very briefly in a remark in the paper. Q is the set of all empirical distributions of possible tasks. So an element of Q will look like this here, where you just have a sum of equally weighted atoms, and the atoms are exactly placed at the sample that you observe. Calligraphy C, as we said before, will denote an optimality criterion, and this will evaluate to either 1 or 0, depending on whether the optimality is satisfied or not. This doesn't mean that you have to memorize everything perfectly. So for example, a valid optimality criterion that we will be looking at a couple of times in examples in these slides is the epsilon error bound. So assume you have some linear model, for example, and you just want to upper bound the mean error produced by this linear model on each task, then this here is an optimality criterion that works for you. Okay, and lastly, SAT-T is the satisfiability set of task T, aka all parameter values that satisfy whatever optimality criterion we specify at task T. And once you have this notation in place, it becomes quite clear that optimality on all tasks is exactly equal to no catastrophic forgetting. Optimality on all tasks thus means that theta T at each task T must lie in the intersection of all previous satisfiability sets. And then you need to formally prove that it's actually valid to pursue the analysis in terms of these satisfiability sets. And we do that in lemma 1 in the paper. I'm not going to torture you with that. It's just a technical finding that you can focus on these sets. And the meaning of lemma 1, which is important, is that optimal continual learning has a set theoretic interpretation that's depicted here. At each point, you get these tasks, but via the optimality criterion you specify, they get converted into a set. And then you need to find the intersection, or you need to find a point in the intersection of these sets at each time point. Okay, and that leads us to the question how hard it is to actually find intersections or a point in the intersection. And intuitively, if you've come into contact with complexity theory before, it should be clear that the decision version of this problem is a lower bound computationally on what we're trying to do with continual learning. And this is the next lemma. And before we can state it, we need to find two more things. So SAT-Q is simply the set of all satisfiability sets you could encounter. And SAT-intersect is just the set of all finite intersections of elements of SAT-Q. And with that in place, you can then say optimal continual learning is computationally at least as hard as deciding whether an intersection of two elements, one from this set, the other from this set, is empty or not. Because if we want to find a point ultimately, we need to first be able to decide whether or not this intersection is empty or not. And with that in hand, you immediately get your NP-Hardness result as soon as either SAT-Q or SAT-intersect are sufficiently complicated. And when I say sufficiently complicated, I don't mean that they have to be really complicated. In fact, it suffices if the subset, if one subset of either of those two sets is a set of polytopes on your parameter space. It also suffices if they're tropical hypersurfaces. And in both cases, the proof just says, well, we have this intersection problem, and for this intersection problem, it's well known that the decision version is NP complete. So the one that I showed in the previous slide, that problem is NP complete in both cases, but we don't want the decision version of the problem. We actually want the optimization version of the problem because we want to ultimately find a parameter value theta in the intersection. It's not enough for us to just say whether that intersection is empty or not. And that allows you to conclude that the problem is generally NP-hard. And just to remind you that polytopes are actually not very complicated shapes, sort of the easiest geometric shapes you can come up with because they're just obtained by intersecting half spaces. Even if you have these kinds of sets in SAT-Q or SAT-intersect, your optimal continual learning algorithm will attempt to solve an NP-hard problem. Okay, and just to give a simple example that suffices to show NP-hardness, all you need is the linear model. So theta is a coefficient vector. As before, Q just denotes all empirical measures. So you get a sample, you convert that into an empirical measure, right? C, as before, is the epsilon upper bound in the L1 norm. So you're just trying to keep the mean absolute error to be lower bounded by epsilon in each tasks. And now you can show that SAT-intersect contains all polytopes in theta. And you can see this by seeing that the single satisfiability set at task T is just given by intersecting these two half spaces here. And this is defined as the intersection of sets of this form. So you can see by just intersecting enough of these sets, you'll get any polytope in theta. Okay, so you might ask, why do we care about linear models, right? We're ultimately interested in more complicated models. And the answer to that question is basically, if it's already hard for a simple problem, it will be even harder for a problem that produces more complex sets, aka neural networks or nonlinear models. And we formalize this in corollary 1, where all we really say is, well, if A and B are such that, or if SAT Q and SAT intersect are such that intersecting their sets is as hard as for polytopes, then your optimal continual learning algorithm is again NP-hard. And this should be taken to mean that essentially the optimal continual learning algorithms we would be aiming for in practice are all NP-hard. Okay, now we need to talk about memory. And in order to talk about memory, we first need to define a notion of perfect memory. The intuition when you see this graph and you know that you have to navigate all these different possibilities within it tells you that you basically need to remember everything that happened previously, at least some subset of that. And the question becomes, how big a subset is big enough? And in order to answer that question, we look at equivalence sets. You can think of equivalence sets as redundance classes. So really, all they are a collection of redundant parameters. So if you have one of them, you don't need any of the other ones. And you obtain them simply by saying, well, for all sets A that contain, so all sets A in SAT Q, which contain some value theta, I define the equivalence set as the intersection of all these sets. And the intuition is the graph below. So if you see there are only 3 sets in this case that contain theta, all the sets that contain theta, in this case, also contain theta prime, which tells you that theta prime is exactly as good as theta, right? Like whenever you have theta in a set, you also have theta prime in a set. So therefore, they're no different. And with this in hand, we say perfect memory is achieved if you need to store at least one element of each such equivalence class. So formally, that means that of each E theta such that E theta is a subset of the satisfiability sets you've encountered so far, you need one value. And to give an example here, this is the whole space theta, which the equivalence sets divide into 5 different components here. And to achieve perfect memory, all you need is one single element out of each of these equivalence sets. And with that in hand, you can basically derive 2 straightforward results. The first is lemma 4. And basically what lemma 4 tells you is that optimal continual learning needs to memorize enough to solve the set intersection problem. Well, that part isn't too difficult to understand intuitively once we've seen that you can always solve that problem. More interesting is corollary 2, because corollary 2 tells you that you can only solve the set intersection problem with perfect memory. And here I should note that the condition we give in corollary 2 is much stricter than what you need. We give relaxed conditions in the paper. Once again, the linear model example we've seen before actually suffices to show that you get perfect memory, because now you can actually show that SAT Q contains theta, so the singleton of theta, and the way you can construct this is just choosing xt and yt such that this equality is solved exactly by one unique theta in big theta, and this can always be achieved if you choose y and x appropriately. Okay, so what are the practical ramifications of this? What really this reveals is that the challenge in optimal continual learning is designing good ways of moving from the intersections of satisfiability sets up to time t-1 or task t-1 up to the next intersection. And in general, we need perfect memory to do that without any error. And this is exactly why we expect memorization techniques to work better in practice than such techniques that are based on regularization strategies, because they sort of mimic perfect memory. Okay, just a brief summary. We connected set theory with catastrophic forgetting, used that to prove NP-Hardness and perfect memory requirements of optimal continual learning. And that had practical ramifications, namely, you are actually designing heuristics for an NP-hard problem, and you should expect memorization techniques to work better than regularization techniques. Okay, with that, I come to an end. Thank you very much.